My phone told me this morning that today is Max's birthday, so let's all, I'm not going to sing, but just telepathically send Max your happy birthday vibes all the way to New Orleans. This is a multi-pronged project that documents and interprets the history of civil rights organizing in a place that most people don't think of as a site for civil rights movements, the state of Texas. We're hoping to prove that it has been and continues to be a site of significant civil rights thinking, acting, and moving that still has something to teach us. We created the project with several goals in mind. First and foremost, we wanted to create an archive of first-person accounts of what it was like to be involved in civil rights in various communities through Texas. We wanted a body of scholarship, a body of evidence, of first-person evidence that we could use and that other scholars could use as the basis for histories of civil rights movements in the state. So to that end, we interviewed hundreds of people, and we created a digital project, a web archive that is unfortunately down today. I'll show you an example of what it looks like, but I do encourage you to take a look at this as soon as the server's back up and running. The web address is CRBB, Civil Rights in Black and Brown, crbb.tcu.edu. We wanted to create this web archive and make it as accessible as possible so that, again, we could write the book that is based on this body of evidence, but we wanted to make it as available as possible to as wide a group of people as possible. We wanted other grad students and other scholars throughout the state to use this. And anecdotally, I've been really happy to hear how many grad students are working on dissertations and using this archive already. The people at the Portal to Texas History tell me that it's already one of the most used collections that they have these days. When people apply for fellowships, they're applying to use the Civil Rights in Black and Brown Oral History Collection. We're hoping that this catalyzes a new generation of civil rights scholarship. So we created this for scholars, we created this for ourselves first, but we created it for anyone who's interested. We want journalists to use it. We want teachers to use it when they teach Texas history and US history in middle school and high school throughout the state. It's been really gratifying to do teacher institutes where we show people how to use this, and you see light bulbs go off over their heads and they say, oh, I can work this into such and such a lesson plan, and I'm so excited about this. I'm going to go back to whatever community in Texas they're in to do that. That's been really fun. Journalists have been using this. Just in the past few months, obituaries of people whom we had interviewed who've died recently, obituaries in the New York Times and the Austin American-Statesman, probably others that I haven't noticed, but they have used the CRBB archive to deepen what they could tell about this person. Unfortunately, I don't know if this is an exciting use of the project. It's been one of the most meaningful uses of the project. One of the sites where we did dozens of interviews was Uvalde. And the movement in Uvalde centered on a school walkout in 1970 when Mexican-American families objected to their treatment in the schools, forcing them to speak English, a series of things that they were upset about that centered on the Robb Elementary School. And so when the shooting occurred at Robb Elementary School, journalists from around the country were using the materials from the CRBB archive to tell a much richer, much deeper story about issues in Uvalde than they would have been able to otherwise. But other journalists around the state are using it for hopefully more uplifting reasons than that particular reason. So about 10 years ago, Max had the idea. He looked around. He knew that I was doing civil rights oral history interviewing from my perch in Denton. He was doing civil rights interviewing with his students here at TCU. our colleagues Marvin Delaney and Jose Angel Gutierrez were doing the same from UT Arlington. He looked around, he said, maybe there's a way for us to do this together, either combine our resources and do something bigger and better than we'd be able to do ourselves, or we can at least get together and talk about ways to avoid stepping on each other's feet. And so we started having those conversations 10, 11 years ago, something like that. We immediately agreed that we wanted to work on something together. So we started looking for foundation money. To do that, we wrote an application for the National Endowment for the Humanities through the collaborative research grant program that they have. Presumably they still have. We'll see where things are headed in the next couple of months. But put together this idea to train grad students in oral history methodology and then send them around to not just DFW sites, but places around the state where we knew there had been significant organizing, significant activism in the past, but that wasn't really making it into the archives yet, and there weren't other oral history programs actively interviewing in these places. So we didn't get the NEH grant the first time. We did get it the following year, but that first time we tried, we did get enough foundation money from, I believe, the Summerlee Foundation and a couple of others, that allowed us to hire 4 grad students that first summer, trained them up in oral history, sent them out to various places around DFW to do interviews, and then to various places around the state. We mainly concentrated on there we go. That first summer, we mainly concentrated on the Rio Grande Valley and Deep East Texas. So they were interviewing, unfortunately, this map cuts it off, but they were doing interviews down in Edinburgh and Farr and McAllen. They did a few in El Paso. Another team was doing interviews in Marshall and Tyler. I don't think that time they got down to Lufkin and Diboll, but and all around the Brazos River Valley. The following summer, we did get the NEH grant, and we were able to hire about a dozen students who you see here. I know that some people in the room know some of these people. And one of the amazing things about this is that when you do historical research, for the most part, you do it by yourself. 9 times out of 10, historians who take on a project take it on individually, and they spend the bulk of their time in archives by themselves. If they do oral history, they're going out and interviewing people by themselves. That was not the case with this one. This was truly collaborative. It involved as many as 15 or 16 people all told, and we worked into our processes a lot of chances to get together, like you see us in this picture, to talk about what's working, talk about what's not working. Here are some other themes we could be. Together, we were able to come up with a much better project than we would have been able to come up with as individuals. So over 2016 and 2017, these are all the places around the state where the teams did interviews. We paired the grads, I keep calling them grad students, even though all of the people in these pictures are now professors and public historians and contributing members of society, but back then they were grad students. We paired them up. Typically, we would have one person responsible for the interview, for the question, and the other person would be responsible for the technology, and they would switch up throughout the day, do 3 or 4 interviews a day, and embed themselves in communities for months at a time, and just really get to know these places. So they recorded over 500 oral histories. I'm going to try and show you this, and hopefully this will cooperate. Again, the CRBB website is down, but this is the image you'll find if you use the Internet Archive Wayback Machine. So I can at least prove that it exists when the servers work. The 500 interviews came back to TCU. Max hired a series of grad students and undergrads who clipped the interviews and applied keyword tags to them using the Library of Congress controlled vocabulary. And if this was working, you would be able to, I don't think we're able to do it here, but if you have a keyword that you're interested in, school desegregation, police brutality, voter rights, whatever the civil rights term you're interested in, you can put it in there. If you're not interested in a theme like that, but you're interested in a particular place, and we did interviews in that place, or we have people talking about that place wherever they did do their interview, you can type Fort Worth in there and it will bring you up all the clips in which people talk about civil rights organizing in Fort Worth. If you're only interested in a specific person, memories of Martin Luther King, memories of Juanita Craft, memories of Halcyon Watkins, whatever the case is, you can type that name in and it'll bring up clips either of that person sharing their memories or other people talking about them. So it's entirely usable in that way. It also suggests connections that might not be obvious if you were just reading full transcripts of interviews, right? So it uses my understanding, I think I've already proven, not the tech guy, but my understanding of how Jacob, the digital librarian at TCU, put this together is that he used off-the-shelf algorithms, software, programs that were common to consumer software that like Netflix would use. You liked this video, I would suggest that you'll like these other videos, right? The kinds of suggestions you get from Netflix or other streaming services like that. So the site, if you're interested in one particular theme and one particular place, it will also suggest other clips of interviews from those particular places or those themes across places, right? It suggests connections and patterns that, again, if you were just going into the archive and reading transcripts, it would take you forever to make those connections. So this is a huge part of the project. It made it so much easier for us to write the book when we got to the next phase of the project than it would have been otherwise. And we hope that it's making it much easier for other scholars, other non-academic scholars, journalists, teachers, anyone else throughout the state who wants to use this. We think this makes it even more usable for them and even more valuable for them that way. It also lives at the Portal to Texas History at UNT. I'm going to play a clip from that in a minute, but I just want to make sure that especially the academic scholars in the audience know this. If you don't just want to watch clips taken out of context from full interviews, you can watch the full interviews at the Portal to Texas History. So 500 plus full interviews, I don't know, 800 or 900 hours worth of interviews are there available at the Portal to Texas History, which is the premier digital archive for Texas history. I have to say that as a UNT employee. It's the best. It's the best that's out there. So that's kind of the backstory to the book. What else do I need to say about that? Once we had created this archive, once we had started to let people know that it was out here, once we had created all of the experts on civil rights organizing in various communities throughout Texas that you see in these pictures, once they had come back from their interviews, we had a great Facebook page in which the teams would post pictures from their interviews throughout the state. If you're interested in seeing that documented, I really encourage you to look at the CRBB Facebook page. I just pulled a couple of pictures from it, but you see Meredith May, TCU PhD, and Jasmine Howard here in this picture on your left. I can't remember the names of the people that they're interviewing in Deep East Texas there, but they were ensconced in the piney woods, behind the pine curtain in Deep East Texas for an entire summer and did dozens, if not hundreds of interviews with people whose stories otherwise, might be lost to us. I believe that's Susanna Almanza, who is a longtime activist in Austin, who you see there on the right. But One fun thing about the Facebook page is that it just includes so many people from all of these places. And it's a good document of just the summer work and what was on people's minds at the time. So once we had created the archive, Max and I had originally planned on co-writing a narrative history of civil rights movements in Texas. And we very, very quickly came up against a big problem, which is that this is a big state. And this is a diverse state. And it's a very complex state. And we just immediately realized you can't tell a story about the civil rights movement in Houston that also makes sense for Lubbock. You can't tell the story of the RGV that holds water in East Texas and movements that cropped up in urban areas, had concerns that rural people didn't necessarily have. There's just, it would be really hard to write a comprehensive account of the civil rights movement across the state, across the board, in that big sweeping narrative fashion. Max and I both really admire books like John Dittmer's Local People, which does that for Mississippi, Adam Fairclaw's book that does that for Louisiana, Stephen Tuck's book that does that for Georgia. We initially thought we were going to try to do something like that. We couldn't figure out how to do it. What we did figure out was that if you really do want to tell the story of the state, and you really want to do justice to the biracial, interracial, sometimes nature of civil rights movements in Texas, what you have to do is really drill down in these places. You have to laser focus on the concerns that people had in a given place over a long period of time. And we had, over the course of 2 summers, created experts on those places. You see them here in this picture. So after we gave up on the idea of the big sweeping narrative history, we said, why don't we write an edited collection that draws on all of the expertise that you see in the picture? All of these people are such experts on their places. Why don't we each have them write a chapter? And we're not going to tell you what you have to write about. You just have to write it about this place that you became an expert in. You tell us what the major theme is. If school desegregation was the big issue in that community, then write about school desegregation in that community. If responses to police brutality were the big issue in that community, then you write about that. If access to health care was the civil rights issue in this community, write about that. And they did. So we found that by really drilling into so many of these different places, you could then start to look for patterns that you could make some generalizations about the state as a whole. One of the first ones that suggested itself was that responses to police brutality were the overriding civil rights issue in the state of Texas over several decades. Not just a Black Lives Matter era issue. Across decades, across communities, Lubbock, Houston, far in deep South Texas, right on the border, Dallas. So many of these communities had movements that were responses to police brutality. So we knew that we had to tell sort of an overarching, generalized story about that. Access to quality education is another one, of course, that comes up again and again across places. Access to health care. Biggest in El Paso, but a civil rights issue throughout the state. It was only by digging in and laser focusing on all of these places that you could really see those patterns emerge. We also found that in some places, Black communities and Hispanic communities tended to organize within themselves. In other places, that tended to be the case in middle class groups. The more working class a group was, it seemed it was more likely to work across ethnic lines with other people from that class who were working on similar issues. And we found that African American and Mexican American communities were more likely to find ways to do that in the big cities than they were in smaller towns. The picture of interracial organizing in Texas is a really complex one. If you've read Brian Binken's book, Fighting Their Own Battles, you know that if you look at this at a certain level, you find very little cooperation across time. He calls his book Fighting Their Own Battles because he has so many examples of black activists getting mad at Mexican-American activists and vice versa, and they say, well, let them fight their own battles. I'm done trying to cooperate with them. And again, that's the case on the statewide level. It's the case in more middle-class movements, but we found that the more working class and origin of movement was, the more likely people were to work across those ethnic lines. So that's another one of the patterns that we tried to identify and write about in the book. Now that I've told you about the oral history project behind it and sort of the big picture look at the book itself, I want to use my remaining time to talk about the chapter that I wrote for the book about Tarrant County. And I moved here in 2005. For the longest time, when I asked people about, I didn't know very much about Fort Worth when I moved here. I'll give you an illustration. I'd gone to grad school at UT. My wife and I met there. A couple of times we had come up to Fort Worth to go to the museums. And in the meantime, we were living in Atlanta, where I directed the Tuskegee Airmen Oral History Project before I came to UNT. We're moving back here, and we're thinking, you know, we could live in Denton. Kind of a culture shift to move from a place like Atlanta to a place like Denton. So we weren't sure about that. We could move to Dallas, and I could commute, but having lived in Austin, that felt like just giving up on life. And I didn't know the saying, life is too short to live in Dallas then, but we kind of felt that way. Austin feels the same way that Fort Worth feels about Dallas. But we thought, we liked Fort Worth when we visited, and I could commute from Fort Worth. And we sat down and thought about it, like, the museums are so great. The other thing that we know about Fort Worth is that the Star-Telegram is Molly Ivins' home newspaper, and we love Molly Ivins. So Fort Worth must be a really liberal place. And it'll be a fun place for that reason for us to live. And so that's what we knew about Fort Worth. That did not turn out to be entirely the case, although we do like it. We do like it here. I most like it because I keep commuting to Denton. But when I moved here, I started telling this story. When I moved here, everyone I asked about the civil rights movement in Fort Worth said, oh, we didn't have a civil rights movement in Fort Worth because we didn't need one, because the powers that be, the guys in charge, the politicians, and the department store owners and everyone else, they were just so progressive that they desegregated on their own, and that meant that it wasn't necessary. About the 10th time I heard that, I took it as a dare. Like, that can't possibly be right. I have to look into this. And one of the ways that I started looking into it was through what happened in Mansfield. How many of you know about the Mansfield crisis? I knew a little bit about it because of the book that Robin Duff-Ladino had published, I think while I was in grad school. Anyway, I had read it in grad school. It's a good history of the Mansfield crisis, so I at least knew that that existed. Even before the CRBB project started, shortly before that, UNT was gifted the entire Channel 5 archive. Channel 5 had the first nightly newscast in the entire southwestern United States. And I think in 2012, Channel 5 gave UNT Special Collections the entire analog archive, right? So going back to, I want to say the early 50s. I can't remember when the first one was. The very early versions of this, they just had the film with no audio, and they had the scripts. So this is gifted to UNT. The special librarian, the Special Collections librarian, Morgan Geringer, came to me and said, I've got to digitize some of this just so I know what's on it, but it's so expensive, what should I prioritize? And I said, well, why, start with the Mansfield crisis. I'd like to see how they covered the Mansfield crisis. And I'm going to play for you a clip from one of those newscasts that she digitized because she knew that this was one of the dates of the Mansfield crisis. As you'll see, it starts not with the Mansfield crisis, but a different crisis in Fort Worth when Lloyd Austin becomes the first African-American person to buy a house on Judkins Street in Riverside. So this starts with the white reaction to Lloyd Austin moving into the Riverside neighborhood. I'm going to warn you, some of the images in this are really, really awful, so look away if you need to. It includes white people organizing to stop him, and then it moves on to the Mansfield crisis. And some of the images from that are even worse. By the end of this, let me know if you think there was never a need for a civil rights movement in Fort Worth. The story that I kept hearing. So I was starting to learn about the civil rights movement in Fort Worth, some of the contours of it even before we started interviewing on a large scale. When we did start interviewing on a large scale, we were able to record an interview with Lloyd Austin. We were able to get the story behind this. What's going through his mind as this white mob shows up outside of his house and tries to keep him from moving in? What goes through his mind when he sees the signs that they marched back and forth with? What goes through his mind that night when he shoots at the crowd? You'll see a picture of a shot up car in a second. Mr. Austin shot back. Oral history really allows us to dig into those kinds of questions and get those first person perspectives. We interviewed several people who were, at least one person who was a plaintiff in Jackson v. Rawdon, the case that desegregated, or at least that the federal courts said should result in desegregating Mansfield High School. We were able to interview Clifford Davis, the attorney who fought their case. We were able to have him walk us through the legal strategy of, he's working with the NAACP, the legal strategy of why they have to do this, why they have to desegregate. How do you get a federal judge to agree with that? What do you do when the mob stops enforcement of that federal judge's ruling? What do you do when the state attorney general comes after you for that? The state attorney general brought him up on charges of barratry, which is essentially ambulance chasing. And he had to fight for his law license for the next several years. The NAACP is effectively banned from the state based on this for the next several years. We're able to get Attorney Davis to walk us through all of these issues in so much more detail through oral history than you can get from other sources. So I knew this about Fort Worth. This is what I wanted to write about. I wanted to write about the struggle to desegregate schools. Attorney Austin is influential in that story throughout. I wanted to find out what it was like for the people who are both pushing this change and living through this change. The oral histories are able to do that. I wanted people to tell us about their strategies that resulted in more equal political representation. These are all the stories that come up in Fort Worth, but the kind of organizing principle that I saw there was the kind of exercises of white supremacy that you see here. Civil rights movements in Fort Worth all had to fight against this overwhelming, violent white supremacy. We have to think of what happened here in the same way that we think about Birmingham and Jackson and other sites of the civil rights struggle. They had to come up with creative ways to fight back against this. Sometimes they did so across color lines, other times they organized within their own communities, but it all came down to fighting back against this. What happened at Mansfield is essentially what happens at Little Rock, except that nobody does anything about it the way President Eisenhower did at Little Rock, right? A federal judge says the Mansfield High School has to desegregate. Governor Shivers says, you and what army are going to force us to desegregate? They allow the mob to form. They send in Texas Rangers not to control the mob, but to make double sure that the students don't try to come in. And the Eisenhower administration doesn't do anything about it. When they do the same thing in Little Rock the following year, Eisenhower is forced to do something about it. I would argue in part because of the reaction in Mansfield. So I knew that this was, if you take nothing else away from this, I hope you walk out of here thinking that Fort Worth was a site of really significant civil rights organizing and protest, and maybe even more so, a site of white backlash against it. So these are the things that I wanted to explore in my chapter. I hope I did, at least fairly well. And to give you an example of what I hope I'm able to bring out in the chapter, but even more so, an example of what I think oral history makes possible for people who do this kind of history. I want to play you a short clip from an interview that I did with Esdras Tucker. I know lots of you probably know Esdras, or you at least know of him if you've spent much time in Fort Worth. But Esdras was one of the students who integrated Fort Worth schools. Not in 1954. He's going to walk you through this. And I can't show you the entire interview, but in the interview, he talks about what a nurturing atmosphere he had as a student at Como High School, how he did not have all of the resources he knew that other students at other schools in Fort Worth had, but he felt supported there. He's then told that he has to leave Como High School for his senior year of high school to integrate Western Hills. I think oral history is really good at helping you understand the feelings behind that. He's going to walk you through some of the legal stuff that's going on that leads to desegregation. And you get all of that from a book, you can get all of that from an archive. But he also says, I can tell you how it felt. And oral history is really good at that. So I'm just going to play you about 4 or 5 minutes worth of Esdras's interview, and then I'll be very happy to take any questions you have.
I happened to be a junior when the 4th Independent School District made a decision to integrate, to desegregate the schools. And in those days, there were 4 predominantly African-American schools, Como being one of them. And the decision was made probably, I think it was December 71, January 72. The school board, they kept it hush, didn't disclose anything until just a few weeks before the school year. And we got notice that the school that was part of our home, our identity, none of us knew of any other options. It was a very, again, a very close-knit, woven within our identity, who we saw ourselves as a junior. All those years of leading up to finally graduating, to get a letter a few weeks before that saying that closing the school was traumatic, in some ways more traumatic than what we knew. So we were given the options of going that class. We could about half went to Heights, Arlington Heights, the other half went to Western Hills. But it was nothing like graduating at your own school.
I can imagine.
So it felt like being orphaned, being in a place as seniors. My sister was a freshman in high school, so she had 4 years at Western Hills, had 1 year. And the things that I remember, and again, as a student, I really haven't went back to try to validate or fact check all of it, but I know how it felt. And so that 1 year, I didn't feel any overt hostility. We made a lot of friends, we were included in a lot of things, but little subtle things so a number of us had been officers within the National Honor Society, and participating with kind of district or city or even regional National Honor Society activities. We weren't even notified of the chapter at Western Hills. And Western Hills was a new school, just not very old, so it could have been part of it, but we were very much recruited and eager. I mean, it was an eager welcoming for us to play sports, basketball and football and run track. That same eager reception didn't carry over to the Honor Society and the available scholarships. It just wasn't just felt again like being displaced as seniors in the most important year of our school experience. So.
Okay, so you were born, if I have my math right, 2 months before the Supreme Court issued the Brown decision in May 1954.
May 17th, the date of one of my best friend's birthday, so
Okay.
I'll always remember that.
Okay.
Yeah.
And it took until your senior year in high school before Fort Worth really started desegregating its schools and meeting the terms of the Brown decision, right?
Right.
Looking back on that, how do you account for it? Number one, that it took so long for the school district to comply, and number two, that the way it chose to comply was to break up black schools and black community institutions rather than approaching it in some other way.
Right. So, so a couple of different lenses. One is
I just want to say, I know that's a terrible question. As someone who teaches graduate seminars in oral history, I teach people not to ask big, long-winded, multi-part questions and ask open-ended questions that don't telegraph what you want the answer to be. I know that's a bad question, so you don't have to tell me that. I already know that. But I also kind of had a feeling of what he was going to say about it, so that's my excuse.
I grew up being increasingly aware, especially as an adult, of the incredible work of civil rights pioneers and court work like Judge Clifford Davis, who was instrumental in the school desegregation plans. And so the district didn't do it because they were visionary and because they wanted to be inclusive. They did it because they were being sued and there were some local actions happening. So that motivated them. But then as a student, as a junior, as a 17-year-old, it felt disrespectful. It felt like they definitely could care less about the quality of our education, let alone our overall well-being. And then as I got a little bit older, and I mean a lot older, even within that senior year, it became clear to me that one of the likely ways that came about was it was more preferable to close our schools, and they closed Como and Kirkpatrick on the north side that same year, and the historic Iron Turtle High School the following year. Dunbar was a very new school. That was the only school they left open. But it was clear that they would rather close those schools than bring equity with resources and bus white students into black communities. That didn't seem to be an option for them. And I think that was part of their rationale for not disclosing that early enough so that there could be public meetings, public forums to discuss the merits of it. I also learned later that the resources, that we paid taxes like everybody else, the school district taxes, but the resources weren't very equitable when you look at the textbooks and the science and the labs. It's just a disparity between the resources that we were able to draw upon. So for me, increasingly, that decision had everything to do with the quality of the integrity of the district in our local leaders.
All right, I'm going to leave it there in the interest of time. But again, I think oral history makes it possible for historians to access those kinds of feelings, those kinds of memories, those kinds of emotions in ways that other historical sources don't. And so that's one reason that I'm so proud of this project and all of the people who worked on it to create this amazing website that hopefully TCU will have up and running again in a matter of days, but that you can also access through the Portal to Texas History if you're interested in seeing Estras's full interview. I'll leave it there and try to answer any questions you have.
Any questions?
Yes, ma'am.
I'm interested in the role of the school board as this desegregation was happening. I live in a neighborhood where the elementary school was being integrated.
Mm-hmm.
I've only been told this by people who have lived in the neighborhood at the time, but the president of the school board was the priest at the Episcopal church in the neighborhood, and he was against desegregation, and there was a retaliation that, an incident that was regarded as retaliation by the white people in the neighborhood.
I have not come.
Against that church, a fire.
Uh-huh.
Have you run across that?
I have not come across that particular one, but I don't doubt hearing it. You know, in some ways, that's a very common story, not just in Fort Worth, but elsewhere. One of the things I found in going through Star Telegram archives was that Mr. Austin's story in Riverside was extremely common in Fort Worth. Every 5 or 10 years from before World War I until the 1960s, every time a black family moved onto a certain street, they would be firebombed out. Opal Lee's family is the famous story here from the late 1930s. But that happened again and again and again. In that particular case, I don't know that particular story, but I do know that the school board delayed desegregation for as long as it possibly could. Federal order after federal order came down, and they were able to maintain the segregated system well into the 70s. That's a part of our history that we have to acknowledge and think about.
Question in the back.
Go ahead.
Yes, Al Henderson here. Redlining being prevalent during those times, I was just interested in your interview with Mr. Austin. What strategy did he use to get that house?
I can't remember. I'm sure it's in the interview. I can't remember exactly. I wish Blake Gandy was here. Blake is a PhD student at TCU who's actually writing about redlining and residential segregation and desegregation in Fort Worth. He can fill in a lot of what I can't. I can't remember if Mr. Austin used this strategy or not, but in some other cases they would have white buyers, kind of front for them, or different corporate structures that people came up with to front for African American buyers. Unfortunately, I can't remember exactly what Mr. Austin's strategy was. Yeah. Question in the back.
Yes, sir. History is past, present, and future. Obviously, these things on national level, this is national American history, the brutalities and all of that. So, big picture, 3 of the governors of the 5 most important states and the newly reinstalled president of the United States don't want kids to know this, don't want this to be discussed among adults nationwide. So, where are we going to go with this?
We're going to keep talking about it for as long as we possibly can, you can try to hide history. You can try to put it behind a closed door, but you can't kill it. At least in the long run, this is not going away. I have a lot more that I could say about some of the decisions that some of those leaders are making that I disagree with, but I feel deep in my bones that the truth will out, and you can try to hide it for as long as you want, but that's ultimately a losing proposition. That doesn't mean there won't be a lot of blood, sweat, and tears along the way, but I'll keep talking about it.
And we've got a couple of Zoom questions.
Sure. So the first one I see is Texas Monthly tells me all the time that Northeast Texas includes Marshall, Tyler, and Lufkin. I noticed you had no interviews from Northeast Dallas all the way to Texarkana. We did have some, let me pull up that map just so I'm remembering correctly. You're right, we don't have any north of Dallas and Marshall all the way to the, you know what, they've got Arkansas as Missouri in this map. Did we publish that in the book? Suzanne, could you look at the front of the book and see if we... Oh boy. We did not do interviews in that part of the state simply because we couldn't cover everything. And We had a team that did interviews in Marshall and Tyler, and it took them long enough to get established in those communities and start doing interviews. It's at the very beginning of the book. It took them long enough to get established in those communities before they moved on to do interviews in Bryan and College Station that summer, and Prairie View, that they did not go north of Dallas and Marshall. I do want to say that, is it Missouri in the book? Oh, brother, I can't believe we didn't catch that. How embarrassing. I can't believe we didn't catch that.
Should we let Max know on his birthday that that's
Yeah, text him. You know, this project is not the end-all be-all, and we hope that it encourages not only people to use evidence from the archive, but also to, you know, go out and start their own oral history projects. And we're not the only ones in the state doing it. So there are people at Stephen F. Austin, for instance, who are interviewing in that part of the state. Hopefully, Thomas, somebody will, or excuse me, Skipper Steely, somebody will get to work on that part of Northeast Texas. All right, another question is, what inspired me to dive into the study? Part of it was, again, just feeling like I was being dared to find civil rights activity in Fort Worth by all the people who were saying that there was none here. That was my biggest impetus. But I grew up in Atlanta, and I've always been interested in civil rights history because it's just in the air you breathe in Atlanta. And for whatever reason, I had people who kept encouraging me to do it, so I kept doing it. So that's how I became a civil rights historian. I have a much longer answer than that, but that's where I started. Suzanne.
I'm interested to read the chapter about Henry County because I was born and raised here. And when I was 14, I got thrown out of a convenience store because I said I didn't think it was wrong to go to school with black children. And, but all I know is just a little bit of things that I had that was interested in or happened to me. And I remember them burning what the authors in effigy in Mansfield.
Mm-hmm.
I was about 14. And, but I'm interested in hearing more in depth about what was going on there. I had no earthly, at 14, you know, I just thought, well, why would they throw me out of here?
Yeah, yeah. You know, it's interesting to think about why people had to enforce Jim Crow against white people. You know, had to pretty much criminalize ideas about you know, all men are created equal.
But the news media, I think what I'm trying to say is the news media, except that it happened right to me myself, kept it real quiet.
I have to admit, I was really surprised how much coverage Channel 5 gave to it. The Star-Telegram and the other newspapers across the state wrote a lot about the mob at Mansfield. But you know, it's really unusual to see news coverage, for instance, you saw the Citizens Council getting signatures on a petition to get Mr. Lloyd Austin out of Riverside, this sort of thing. It's really unusual for them to pay any attention to that kind of white organizing. I was surprised at that.
My kids were bused we lived in Forest Hill, in 1970 something, they were bused. You know, they were busing the white children into the black schools and vice versa. And, but it was 1971.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But from the 54 to 71, it was a long time before we got to it.
And so then even in 71, when the district really does start to desegregate, you got a sense from Estes' interview that some communities had to sacrifice a little, and some had to sacrifice a lot.
But why, I want to ask, I didn't catch it, why was he chosen to go to Western Hills?
Everyone from Como had to go to either Arlington Heights or Western Hills.
Did they get to choose, or?
I think he was told he had to. I don't know if they split the neighborhood of Como down the middle or what exactly the reason was for that. Yes?
What about higher education? I know when I was attending college in the 60s at UT Arlington, I only knew this in retrospect. I didn't even think about it. The first black student
Uh-huh.
graduated
Uh-huh.
same time.
And what were the UT Arlington sports teams called back then?
The Rebels.
The Rebels. And what song did they sing? Yeah.
I don't know why. I lived in a white town in Oklahoma with a black town nearby, but I just never subscribed to
Yeah. I mean, it would be
my parents.
it would be like having to make a fish explain why water is wet. You know, it's the world you lived in. I'll tell you that historians argue all the time about whether Texas is southern or western in character, and
It's both, depending on your area.
the kicker for me when I was writing about Tarrant County was that somebody pointed out that Arlington is named for Robert E. Lee's slave plantation. That makes it southern. That was all the evidence I needed. And so the fact that UT Arlington, you know, was the Rebels and they sang Dixie at their sporting events and all that sort of stuff, it really made me think of Tarrant County as a place where the South extends, where the South continues. Maybe the West begins here too. But do we have time for one more?
Yes, of course. And we've got another one on.
Yes, sir. Those were amazing times. My mother worked at Como High School. My dad worked at Kirkpatrick High School. So I was, 11 at the time when the schools were closed. And that was an amazing time. You know, you're a kid, you're trying to kind of take all this in. Mom wound up transferring over to Poly High School. Dad went to Diamond Hill Jarvis, and they both worked out the rest of their careers. But, those four schools were highly intact with community activities, organizations, the churches, the businesses. I co-managed my grandfather's photo archive. And it's amazing. I think those schools were generally only like full schools, like 15 to 20 years. Como and Kirkpatrick and Dunbar, I think, was like 6th grade for a while. But over that 15, 20-year cycle, they did a lot of fantastic.
Yeah. The school board built them when they knew that the Brown decision was coming down, and so they were trying to create a system that was separate but closer to equal. Those schools never received the resources that Pascal and Heights and others did, but that's why they were created when they were created. But you're right, they were community institutions, and they were central to the identity of a lot of people. I wish I could remember the name of this gentleman, but I did a long interview with the gentleman who's essentially the archivist of Kirkpatrick High School. He just kept everything, and walked me through the scrapbook, walked me through the yearbook. You can tell how important that was to him, that he has kept doing this since 1971. I guess that one was turned into a middle school, I guess around that time rather than closed altogether. But yeah, I mean, that community had to sacrifice more than the white community did to make integration happen. This last question is from Beth Englehart, who says she was a senior at Heights and remembers the opening of Western Hills and the splitting of Como students between Heights and Western, but can't remember more than 5 or so African Americans at Heights in 1971. I can't tell you a number of how many African American students would have been there that first year in 1971. We'd have to go find a yearbook to answer that question. But Beth, if you have a yearbook, I'd be interested in hearing it.
The Fort Worth History Center probably does.
The Fort Worth History Center probably has the yearbooks.
You heard it from the horse's mouth.
Going back to my question, when was the first black student admitted to a state higher education?
Let's see. Heman Sweat would have been, when is that case? 1950, I believe, at the UT Law School. Might be 51 or 52.
And
There are several cases throughout Texas and Oklahoma where Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP nibbled away, first at graduate programs and then at undergraduate programs. In UNT's case, Atkins v. Matthews is the case that desegregated UNT, and that was 1955, 1956, I think. The Brown decision doesn't say anything about higher education, but it opens the door for higher education. Yeah. All right, thank you again. Leanna?
Mine is a logistics question. Today, if anyone in our audience here or on Zoom wanted to do an oral interview with a family member, with a community person, is there an app on our phones that you would recommend? Tell us about what the current best technological practice is.
Sure. Of course, the best thing you could do is sign up for the oral history seminar at the University of North Texas, which is taught by a world-renowned expert. If you can't do that, there is an app available on your phone called the StoryCorps app. If you've ever heard StoryCorps on National Public Radio on, Friday mornings, I guess, they play clips from their interviews. This is a down and dirty way to do it, but they have some pretty good just introductory questions to ask, things like that. The app itself will save a recording for you that is archived at the Library of Congress. So you know that it's going to be taken care of. At least in theory, it's going to be well taken care of. And you can then share the recording with family members or community members for whatever purposes you have. There are lots of other ways to do it, but if you're just getting started, I would recommend that app in particular.
All right. Thank you, everybody. We appreciate your attendance today. Thank you, Todd.
Thank you.